Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Liverpool.com podcast. I'm your host, Mo Stewart, back and refreshed and ready to tackle another big LFC topic with my two tail gunners alongside me, Matt Addison and James Martin. Now, for Liverpool, this has been a week in which they've navigated a derby at Goodison that could have felt very weird, but ended up being lots of fun. And hopefully, we've got another such game on the horizon this weekend as Steven Gerrard's Aston Villa, I say that again, Steven Gerrard's Aston Villa comes to Anfield. Matt, it's going to be a weird game for lots of reasons. There's going to be lots of emotion around the fan base. But is this something where the players themselves are going to be able to detach themselves from all of our hoopla, so to say?
Yeah, I think so. There's going to be a lot of talk around it, isn't it? But fundamentally, it's a game that Liverpool have to win. I think you can say that against pretty much every single team outside of Chelsea and Manchester City. Liverpool have to go into it thinking anything less than 3 points is not good enough for them. So I think it's very much a game that I'm sure when we hear from Jurgen Klopp later in the week, he will pretty much say, well, it's just a game. That's what he said about Everton. That's what he said about previous games in the past. And I'm sure, to be fair, Steven Gerrard will say very similar. I think he'll want to, I know he will want to win the game. He'll want to come there and take the 3 points off Liverpool and kind of prove how good a manager he is and how good a team his team are. So, yeah, as much as there will be a lot of chat around it and, for obvious and understandable reasons, ultimately it's two teams that want to win. And that's the long and short of it.
In the Premier League, it always boils down to that eventually, despite what all of the other narratives say. Now, James, one of the other narratives that's springing around is going to be Steven's audition for Klopp's job at some point when Klopp decides he doesn't want it any longer. Now, again, both men are going to be putting that to one side as much as possible. Steven's going to be trying to go out there and prove that he cares more about Aston Villa right now than he does about Liverpool. Now, does that present a danger for us as a team? Because he might not want to say that he loves Liverpool right now, but what he does is he knows Liverpool right now.
Yeah, it's like you say at the start, it's a weird situation. Like, there's just no two ways about it. Everything about it is odd. I don't think it necessarily gives anyone an advantage or a disadvantage. It's just, it adds an extra element in terms of the fans, like how they're going to respond to him, presumably positively, but it's not going to be, something's going to happen, isn't it? I mean, like you say, the narrative is fairly irresistible. Whichever way it goes, there's going to be some sort of line about Gerrard and Liverpool and what it means for the future and what it means now. I mean, he's either helped the title charge or he's derailed the title charge. There's going to be a lot going on, but I don't think the fact that he knows Liverpool will necessarily give him any kind of upper hand in the sense that he left as a player before Klopp came in. It's not like he's like a alum of the Klopp ways. It's not like he knows that system inside out and knows how to counter it. So yeah, it makes things a lot more strange, but whether it gives him an edge, I don't necessarily think it does.
We'll have to wait and see. Well, that's one of the elements that we are going to definitely debate over the course of this show. But what I wanted to do with this show is we've talked about all of the emotion, the weirdness, the narratives. Let's break it down to football, because that's essentially what it is. It's a football game. And we as Liverpool fans, we are still thinking of Stevie in a red shirt. We're not thinking of Steven Gerrard, the manager. So let's do that now. Let's look at Steven Gerrard, the manager. What does a Steven Gerrard team look like? What can we expect to see? Now, Matt, he had 3.5 years at Rangers, and even taking into account a lot of us probably won't have seen a lot of those games, he was there long enough to build up a reputation, to build up some characteristics, not only as a tactician, but as a man manager. What would you say your impression of him at Rangers in those areas was?
I think it's really interesting, actually. I know James mentioned the fact that he wouldn't necessarily have the upper hand in terms of coming to Anfield on Saturday. I think it's almost the other way around in that he is pretty much trying to do what Jurgen Klopp is wanting, but he just doesn't have as good players. So if you try and do that against Liverpool, Liverpool will win because they're better individually. Collectively, I think it's fairly similar now. As you say, I've not seen loads and loads and loads of his Rangers teams, but everything that I have seen and everyone that I've spoken to who has seen a lot more of him up there than I have seems to say that it is pretty similar to how Liverpool play. You had equivalents at fullback who were doing the fullback things that Jurgen Klopp gets his players to do. You had a pretty functional midfield three. Obviously, that's slightly different now with Liverpool, with Thiago having replaced Gini Wijnaldum in there, but fundamentally, it's a similar sort of thing. You've got a centre forward who maybe at Rangers was slightly more sort of traditional number 9 than Roberto Firmino. But again, there's an argument that maybe Diogo Jota has become that over the last few weeks anyway. And then you've got, goals from out wide. Obviously, certain qualities of a Jurgen Klopp team stand out more than others, apart from the fullbacks. I think Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane would be a big one, and essentially that's what he was doing with Ryan Kent, that he obviously bought off Liverpool to go up there. So from what I know of him, it was pretty much a 4-3-3 on occasion, a 4-2-3-1. It was very fullback heavy. It was very, very similar to how Liverpool play. He brought in a similar sort of thing within the goalkeeping situation as well. It was very much a sensible play out from the back when you can, but if you have to go long, it's not the end of the world type thing. I think there's a lot of similarities. I think even off the pitch at Rangers, it was set up in a very similar way. Sporting director, transfers, all of that sort of thing. It was very, very similar. So yeah, I think essentially what Rangers were is a poorer version of Liverpool, which obviously for Steven Gerrard's long-term aims kind of makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense. And I think those are the kind of reasons why people thought that he'd been auditioning for Liverpool from day one. But it could be just that he saw it work and he likes that system. There's no necessarily the guarantee that it's the same thing. However, one thing we have to acknowledge, James, is that Rangers were in a similar position to Liverpool in as much as they were going into every game expecting to win in the SPL. But the quality was very different. So when we're looking at how Rangers play and how Steven Gerrard's Rangers play, and almost in a similar way to how his Aston Villa might play, being in a similar situation, is it more important to look at how they played in European football, where they weren't the big team? They had to go up against some teams who had more experience in Europe and teams who had more quality, and they were still able to hold their own.
Yeah, that's probably the more useful indication. It's a good point to make in terms of the fact that Rangers were in that kind of equivalent position within the context of the league. I think that is what bodes best when you're looking longer term and thinking, how transferable is it to Liverpool? That's the kind of thing we like to see, the fact that he can cope with being one of the dominant teams in the league and deliver on those expectations by playing that kind of dominant style of football where you're expected to keep most of the ball and you're still able to use it effectively. In some ways, it's more indicative of his potential at Liverpool than whatever he'll do at Villa, because as you say, Villa, he'll be going into a lot of games more as the underdog, like he had to do with Rangers in Europe. And yeah, like you touched upon, he did quite well. There's different, depending on who you talk to, you'll get different assessments of it. Some people say he's underperformed, the Champions League. He didn't make it this year through the qualifiers, for example. And then he left before concluding the Europa League group, with that still very much up in the air at the time he left. I think they're looking pretty strong now. I think they've won the game since he left, if I remember correctly. But yeah, there's been some big results in there. I mean, Porto is worth a mention. They were obviously flying the Champions League not long before they played Rangers, and then he comes along and gets a result which is not to be sniffed at. And yeah, started strongly with Villa, as you say, with that kind of, not necessarily games where he'd be an underdog, but games, well, I mean, probably with Leicester, you'd say Leicester were going in as the favourites. The form book maybe disagreed slightly, but it's a game where he's playing one of the teams who are certainly far more established as in the Premier League top half than Villa are. And he's gone along and got a win. So it's 3 wins out of 4 now in that sort of that situation where he has to, punch above his weight. So that is what Liverpool will be looking at in terms of how they need to set up against him. But then the thing with Liverpool and Klopp is that they're pretty much always going to play the same way. But there's tweaks in game, of course there are, and things will change slightly depending on the opposition. But regardless of what Gerrard's going to do, I think we all know roughly the shape Klopp's going to use and the way he's going to instruct his players to go out.
No, I think that's fair. And I think Liverpool are very much in a situation where there are a very small group of teams for whom we will change what we do, and none of them will change it fundamentally. So the onus is very much going to be on Gerrard and Aston Villa to try and find cracks within our system. But I want to focus a little bit more on this European record the Rangers had, because when you think about where they were when he took over, Matt, they were losing to part-timers from Luxembourg. And then by the time it got to him leaving, they were disappointed not to get in the Champions League. Obviously, I think it was Malmo who they lost to home and away to get out of that. So there's a progression there. It's not necessarily just him coming in and having like a new manager bounce and then riding that for a while. There's seems to be able to evolve his team week on week, year on year. So the longer he's going to be able to be at Villa, the more dangerous his teams are going to become.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a case of developing that style, developing the kind of Rafa Benitez in Europe, being defensive, counter-attacking, make sure you don't concede the away goal, that kind of thing. I think Rangers were really quite good at that. And to be honest, that was one of the biggest concerns that I've got with him being at Villa. There's no guarantee of any European football. Even if he's there for 3 seasons, they might not get into Europe. And that's not to say that he could do a bad job and that would happen. It's just that there's so many teams trying to get into Europe at the moment. There's teams who've spent it a lot more. Obviously Leicester, they've won against them last weekend. But then you look at teams like Arsenal, Tottenham obviously with a new manager, you'd expect them to be right up there. I think Steven Gerrard can do a really good job at Aston Villa and not get into Europe, and those two things can happen at the same time. So that's the question mark for me. Obviously, that's something that if he's looking at Liverpool long term, he's got to prove that is the case. And if Aston Villa are not in European football between now and whenever that decision might be, then I think there's maybe a bit of a question mark over that, just because obviously what he did at Rangers was very good, but it is a very small sample size. And I'd have quite liked to have seen him do it for another couple of years in terms of European football, with that being such, a fundamental part of what Liverpool, we presume that they're not going to finish outside of the European places anytime soon. We certainly hope so anyway. So yeah, that's a bit of a concern for me in terms of Villa, because obviously you've got the FA Cup and the Carabao Cup and that, but it's just not the same. It's not even the same format in terms of home and away, playing different styles, all of that kind of thing. I think that would have been important, but that was part of the gamble, wasn't it? He knew that when he went to Aston Villa, and that's kind of the thing that he had to weigh up. So yeah, it's a bit of a question mark, I think, in my head, that, to be honest.
Well, it's a very fair point, that, and let's focus on Villa now, because that's where he is. And in a strange way, James, the same teams who would have given him hope that he can transform Villa, West Ham and Leicester in particular, are his biggest barriers to doing it. Because as Matt said, there are plenty of other teams, the traditional, as we call them, top 6, are more likely than not to get their act together over the course of any 2-year period, in which at least in one of those 2 years, they're going to be fighting for the European places. So they have the raw materials, but so do so many other teams. How are they going to separate themselves? Is this something where we can see them maybe targeting the FA Cup, maybe go on an FA Cup run, win the FA Cup and get into the Europa League that way?
Potentially. I think the aim is always to qualify through the league, because over the course of a full season, that's where the quality really tells. If you get your team playing well enough, then that's the most kind of reliable way to get into the European places. That's not to say it's necessarily the easiest way, but there's just so much left to chance in cup runs. That literally the luck of the draw comes into it. So, I mean, when you're looking at it from a kind of structural 3-year plan sort of perspective, the aim is going to be, let's get into a position where we can qualify through the league and hopefully build on that and do it year on year, rather than a nice cup run. But yeah, it's possible that we'll see some of his best qualities, Gerrard's best qualities, in the cups, when he does have those kind of big occasion games up against potentially bigger teams where he's got to pull off those kind of results, where, as we touched upon, he sometimes managed them in Europe with Rangers. If he can bring that down across the border and do it with Villa, then yeah, a cup run is very possible. But like you say, the league, as Matt touched on, so competitive in those European spots. There's the Conference League now, which could work in Gerrard's favour, the much maligned Conference League. But it's still European football, and to be honest, because of the quality of teams in it, it does give the potential for that sort of Liverpool audition, in the sense that Villa would be going into it as one of the stronger teams, purely because of the financial disparity between the Premier League and other leagues. Basically, any Premier League team who gets into the Conference League is going to be one of the major contenders. So yeah, that would be a chance of seeing what he's like up against, teams from different countries, teams with different styles, and seeing if he can build from a dominant position in Europe rather than as an underdog in Europe, like we saw with Rangers. So it would be interesting if he could manage to get in. But I do think, in terms of what Villa want, it'll be hoping they can make it through the league rather than through one of the cups.
Okay, so let's have a look at what Villa have got as opposed to what they want. Now, Matt, you mentioned that Gerrard very much favours the Liverpool style of play in terms of fullbacks attacking, a functional midfield, wide forwards who can swap sides and cut inside towards goal. Feels like he's got some of those raw materials, but maybe not all of them. I'm looking at Matty Cash and Matt Targett, wondering if they can turn into Trent and Robbo, wondering if we're going to actually see more of Ashley Young, who may not necessarily have the legs, but certainly has those qualities. Thinking about maybe the fact that obviously he doesn't have the full set of forwards available to him. I think Leon Bailey and Danny Ings are both going to be injured for this Liverpool game. But seeing how he uses what he's got in that squad to fit his own configuration, do you think he's going to be able to start thinking that way yet? Or is it simply going to be a case of, in these early weeks, seeing who we've got and trying to get the best 11 out there?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think he will be able to start to get certain things in place. I know Ollie Watkins is someone that has been on Liverpool's radar potentially as a striker. I know they spent about 33 million on him, so God knows what they'd want to get for him now if anybody did come in for him. But I think he's got certain players like that which you can instantly just say, yeah, that they will suit the way that he wants to play. I think Danny Ings would be a big one when he comes back. I think you can sort of see him with Watkins to his left. I think that can work. And obviously Leon Bailey is a bit inconsistent, but again, it is a winger with a lot of quality. The fullbacks are interesting. I think I've thought for the last season or so, really, that Matt Targett was a bit of a weak link within Aston Villa's team. You look across their 11 and they've kind of got pretty good players in all places. And, he's fine. He's just nothing really spectacular. So I think that there will be certain positions. Left back probably is one of them, given that Ashley Young can play there, but is 36 and is Ashley Young. I think that's probably something to look at in the future. But I watched just before the weekend's game Gerrard's interview with Jamie Carragher, and he kind of asked him about what his plan was, and that's basically what he said. He's got, the majority, he's got what he wants, but there's going to be 2 or 3 positions that they have to recruit, but they have to recruit sensibly and get the right player for the right price. It's not just a case of going out and spending a load of money. But I think he accepts that. He knows whichever club he went to, even if he came into Liverpool, I'm sure there'd be certain things that he'd want to improve and change. So it's no different really to any other situation that he's got. But yeah, I think left back for me would be one to look at. The rest of it, I think looks okay, to be honest.
It's an interesting conundrum, though, isn't it? Because I think in the end of the days of Dean Smith, James, there were lots of people who were saying that Villa spent the Grealish money without a really idea of how they were going to configure these players. But maybe it just was a bit of teething problems at the beginning, because I'm like Matt, I can start to see the beginnings of a nucleus of a side in there. Like in the last game, Jacob Ramsey was playing in one of the wide forward positions. I thought he did really well. And Emi Buendia is someone who he's almost felt like a little bit of a spare part to a certain extent, but in this game, he again was playing in the wide forward position, which is not too dissimilar to where Smith was playing Grealish last season. So from an Aston Villa perspective, you can see where they're beginning to maybe find the nucleus as a side, as I mentioned.
I like all of the players they signed individually, but I do very much understand the criticism in the sense that none of them seem to be, except maybe Leon Bailey, seem to be an obvious fit for the way they're going to play. And obviously, having changed the manager again, so the style changes, then the situation just becomes compounded even more. In a 4-3-3, you don't really want to have Ollie Watkins and Danny Ings. Like I know Matt said, Ollie Watkins can play wide, and he has looked quite good there, but he's a striker. He's definitely a striker. Danny Ings is definitely a striker. Emi Buendia, in an ideal world, plays in a number 10. The players they have are the players for like a 4-4-2 Diamonds. Think sort of Rodgers at Liverpool. Like that for me is the ideal shape for Villa to be playing in right now. And Gerrard is probably not going to do that. I mean, he's pragmatic, so maybe he looks at the squad and thinks, okay, we'll give it a go. But as you say, at Rangers, it's been very consistent. He's been sort of copying the Liverpool style, essentially. And, I would expect him to do the same again. That's sort of how it started in the early weeks at Villa. So I don't expect that to change. But yeah, I do think there's a lot of square pegging around whole players now because of how they spent the Grealish money. It's not easy, of course. You got 100 million burning a hole in your pocket. All of the clubs you want to buy from know that. So it's hard to find value. It's hard to know exactly where to strengthen. You can't go out and replace him like for like because he's Jack Grealish. He's a very good player, and anyone of the equivalent standard isn't going to fancy a move to Villa. That's just the reality of it. So you have to be smart with it. And they've done their best and got in some players who I really like. Buendia hasn't necessarily started that well, but in particular, I really do rate him. Player I really like. But yeah, it's going to be a big test for Gerrard to fit them all in. Like I think Ings was fit originally when Gerrard came in, but he benched him in one of the games, and then he's picked up a knock or something. But like. It's a big test to work out how they all gel together, and it'll be interesting to see how he does in solving that puzzle, if you like.
I think the Danny Ings question might be the most interesting one of all, because maybe with the Liverpool link, there's an assumption that he would be his guy, but obviously they weren't there at the same time, were they? I don't believe. I believe Gerrard had left by the time Danny Ings had arrived. So
same summer, was it, I think?
I think it might have been the same summer. So there wasn't really that kind of a connection. And so it's an interesting question. Is he going to be able to stick with him? Because the one knock about Danny Ings throughout his career has been his ability to stay on the pitch. And if you're Steven Gerrard, you're trying to instill a new philosophy. You're trying to build a new team which you can put out week in, week out, so you can get everyone used to a new system. It's difficult to be able to kind of hook your wagon to someone who you can't trust to be in the team every week. Sorry, that was a question to you, Matt. I probably should have.
Fair enough. Yeah. No. I completely agree. I mean, I was expecting James to pop in, given how much he loves Danny Ings. But it's an absolutely fair point. I think the only thing that I would disagree with James on in terms of obviously Watkins and Ings. Well, obviously, I think Watkins can play off the left as well, and that's what he used to do for Brentford. But I think it's a bit about squad depth as well. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to have two players in that position. It's not the worst thing to have, a couple more options. To be honest, it's something you'd quite fancy. Liverpool could probably have done a little bit better in terms of having the squad depth themselves. So, yeah, look, Ings' injury record is not great. They spent a fair bit of money on him, but they've got other options. And I think, I think there are bigger problems than the forward line, put it that way, for Aston Villa. I think certainly left back, like I mentioned before, probably at centre back as well. I'm not a massive fan of Tyrone Mings, if I'm being honest, but yeah, most other areas they look pretty strong.
I'm like you with Tyrone Mings. I feel like that he's just going to get into a situation where he lets him down one too many times, and Gerrard's just going to get rid of him. But that's just me saying that, if you're listening, Tyrone. So let's focus.
I heard you never misses one of these podcasts.
Yeah, you never know. You never know. We are getting bigger and bigger by the week, Dave. I just want to tell you that right now. So let's focus a little bit more on this game and what we can expect to see. Now, Villa have won 3 games under Steven Gerrard already by having less of the ball. They would have seen how Wolves were able to frustrate Liverpool for quite a long time in that game at the weekend, James. It's going to be weird for us to think about Gerrard bringing the team to Anfield already, as we mentioned, but then to see them put 11 men behind the ball, waste time, try to Burnley up the place, that would feel kind of even more strange. But he has to do what's best for his team, right? We need to be able to expect him to come and do these kind of things, surely.
Yeah, like obviously we don't want him to in the short term, but yeah, if you're looking at him in the long term as a potential manager, then of course those are the kind of qualities you want to see, not necessarily from a tactical perspective. Liverpool are never going to be parking 11 men behind the ball themselves, but just in terms of the pragmatism, the playing the occasion, the almost the mind games of it as well, really, that kind of mentality. You need to know how to win. That's just the fundamental, isn't it? And if you're looking at it from an Aston Villa perspective, as Matt touched upon earlier, you're not going to win by playing a worse version of Klopp's system against Klopp. You're just going to get played off the park. You've seen teams try it and it doesn't work. So yeah, in terms of his managerial acumen, you're thinking, okay, well, if he tries to go toe to toe with us, then you're going to raise some questions about how smart he is as a manager. But I think all of that is suspended for this game, because it at the end of the day, if we're talking about Gerrard as a potential future Liverpool manager, it's not until at least 2024. It's also just speculation, essentially based on the fact that he was, a club legend as a player. Like, at the end of the day, we could get to 2024 and FSG is like, no, thank you. We'll go for someone who's got a bit more of a track record. So, yeah, of course, in terms of that is continuing assessment of Gerrard, which is really started in earnest since the Premier League move, you're going to have to hope that he comes along and is snide and is smart and winds up the crowd. But no one at Liverpool is going to necessarily want that in this game.
No, we don't want that. But it might be to Gerrard's advantage to kind of get that, Matt. And this is what I'm getting at, is that we know he's a smart fella. We know that all of these things that we've said about what to expect out of the game, he already knows them as well. He knows that playing the same system against a better team who've been playing it for longer is a recipe for disaster. So he needs something else. He needs to add another element into the game. So he knows the Liverpool crowd, as we mentioned it. He knows some of the players. He was teammates for a club and country with at least two of the players. He was coach for another one. So he has a closeness with them all. He knows their strengths. He knows their weaknesses. Is there something within our game that he knows that he's able to exploit that we haven't even considered yet?
I think there has been a couple of bits of weaknesses this season, but maybe not in recent times. I think you think back to sort of Brentford and West Ham and players being able to dribble the ball forwards. I mean, obviously Jack Grealish isn't there anymore, but that would certainly worry me given what we've seen if he was there. Mm-hmm. It's a case of can maybe Emi Buendia start dribbling forward through the thirds with the ball. That's something that Liverpool have not really dealt with too well at certain times this season. But the last sort of 5 games where they've won and only conceded the one goal, I mean, that just hasn't happened anymore. Liverpool have been far more in control and being able to deal with that a lot better. So possibly that's one he would have looked at earlier in the season and thought if they can make it a bit chaotic in the middle, that might have been one way to get at Liverpool. I'm just not sure if that's true anymore, to be honest. The only other one that I'd say, I can't remember the guy's name, but I think there's a coach there who specialises in set pieces that they've retained from when Dean Smith was there. And I know that's something that Steven Gerrard has done a lot at Aston Villa so far, not least because Leicester are so dreadful at defending them at the moment. It made sense to do that. But I do wonder if they might have some sort of special routine. We've seen a couple of those early on in the 2 or 3 games that Gerrard's had so far. Is there, maybe a little corner routine? Is there a way that they can get on top of Liverpool? Obviously, West Ham had a bit of success with that. Kai Havertz scored as well from a corner, didn't he, for Chelsea earlier in the season. So, look, there's not huge weaknesses within this Liverpool team at the moment, but possibly set pieces might be one, and possibly if they can come up with something clever, they've maybe got the players to possibly pull that off.
They maybe have. I think that's probably where we are at our most vulnerable. It's one of the weird quirks of this season that the teams who are very good at scoring for set pieces aren't necessarily very good at stopping their opponents scoring from set pieces. So I do think that's definitely going to be a battleground we're going to have to keep an eye on. But James, finally on this subject, we've mentioned before that they're going to be trying to do everything they can. We've mentioned before that the crowd themselves are going to have a part to play in this game, for better or for worse. We're not going to see Steven Gerrard go out there and go full Arteta and try and fight with Jurgen Klopp. But is it beyond him to maybe try to manipulate the crowds, maybe even calm placate the crowd, calm everyone down with a wave here and a wave there, and maybe hope that we're all still dazed and confused when it's 0-0 or 77 minutes.
Well, yeah, it's beyond him. If you look at the interviews he's done since he arrived as well, he's been so desperate to kind of refute any sort of residual affection for Liverpool. Obviously, we all know it's there, but he's being very professional. He's focused on Villa. So if he goes out there and starts waving at the cup, it's sort of giving off the wrong vibe, I think. So no, he's just going to get on with it. I think, as you say, we're not going to see any of these Arteta scenes. We're not going to see a bust up between Gerrard and Klopp on the touchlines. Much as we touched on before the show, actually, much as Sky and BT, I'm sure would enjoy it. But no, I think once the whistle goes, it's just going to be a regular game of football, and it just so happens that Steven Gerrard, of all people, is the man on the touchline. I think it'll be the narrative in the lead up and afterwards. But I think, as I say, once the game's underway, it's just going to be another game of Premier League football, and that doesn't mean it's going to be easy, because it never is. But yeah, I think everyone involved is going to be more than capable of forgetting the Gerrard narrative for 90 minutes.
Well, we'll see about that. I think one thing we can all agree on, this is one game where whoever the losing manager is, we will feel some sympathy for him. I think that's probably the line that I'm going to end the show with, because we could go on about this for quite some time. I know that all of you out there have your own feelings about Steven Gerrard, about how you're going to feel if you see him maybe pulling a Cholo, or maybe pulling Mourinho, or maybe doing those things, just shaking Klopp's hand and waving to the crowd. We'll see what happens. Matt, James, thank you again. We'll see you all next week.